Hi, everyone. We're going to start soon. We had oversubscribed, so just trying to switch our accounts so we can have more than 100 people joining just in case. We've had over 100 people joining, so give us 1 second and then we'll start soon. All right, and if you're able to join by video, that would be great. Oh, good. And let me ask everyone to go ahead and put, if you're able to, into your name, just next to your name, what your affiliation is, so that we have everyone here. And I'm just going to do that here. So basically, if you just hover over your picture or over your image, there are 3 dots and you can put rename. So I've just done that here on mine. Unless you're Kate Higgins or Ida and you already have your logo right behind your head. And if folks want to just put into the chat now while we're waiting for others to join, and just make sure that all of our speakers are on. Put into the chat what you're hoping to get out of this conversation. And again, if you're able to join by video, that would be great. We've got a good group here. The folks who have signed up for this, all of you are expert in one aspect of the financing for development issues or another aspect of it. And so we're just really thrilled to have you here joining us. So I'm going to go ahead and get started. Make sure all of our speakers are on. All right. Great. And as I mentioned, go ahead and put into the chat. Don't be shy. You can also just say where you're writing in from. Great. So welcome everyone to Project Starling's side event. Uh-oh, someone's not able to hear me. Raise your hand if you can hear me. Okay. Sorry, Julio. Sorry, Julio. I'm not sure what's going on. But okay, great. All right, so welcome everyone. This is the side event for the FfD PrepCom 3 called Strengthening the Narrative for ODA and Beyond, How Communications Can Help Shore Up Support for Innovative International Development Cooperation. We come to you on the last day of the Financing for Development PrepCom 3, which takes place at a really opportune time. The zero draft of the negotiating document for the Financing for Development outcome has been released. The member states, civil society, all of us who care deeply about these issues have had a chance to take a look at it. And the governments this week were able to provide their initial thoughts on that outcome. We also come to you at a time of, I think people would say, quite a bit of upheaval across the planet in terms of how we're thinking about development cooperation and the role that donor countries, including those of the one that I'm sitting here right now, the United States, the role that they play across the world and their posture towards developing countries, towards other countries, and how we might help solve these problems together. I think, now it feels like we're at a critical moment or a fork in the road, some would say, a sort of a point of decision as to how we're going to come together as a community and either shore up support for development cooperation and international cooperation, multilateralism in general, or whether we succumb to some of the trends that we've been seeing around the world with rising nationalism and isolationism. And I think when you look at the world on fire, the crises that the planet is facing right now, we know that we have a lot of work ahead, and it will require international cooperation. It requires governments, civil society, thoughtful leaders, and citizens to work across boundaries to solve these problems together. And really, that's the spirit of this conversation. There are deep political divisions between societies and within societies. We know that we have to think differently if we're going to try to increase solidarity and renew trust among ourselves and with our governments and across governments. We know that we have to think really differently about the ways that we've been working and the assumptions that we've been making in the past. And so I'm really thrilled today to host this conversation. I'm Mintu Pham, co-founder and CEO of Project Starling, which is a new think and do tank based in various parts of the world, but I am here based in New York, just near UN headquarters. And our purpose is to build a multilateral system that delivers, that works. We are agnostic about the venue or the forum. We want to make sure that development cooperation, international cooperation, and the multilateral system can really deliver on the problems that we're seeing. And so I'm really happy to be here today. We have a great set of speakers. The purpose of this event, as I mentioned, is to advance our collective efforts by helping to strengthen the narrative and really rethink the narrative about ODA, but also beyond ODA. Obviously, ODA is only one narrow slice of the much bigger pie of overall finance. But I think right now it's important to start to unpack some of these things. ODA, the conversations around ODA feel a bit like it's been beating a dead horse, and I think we do need to think differently about that, and that's the purpose of this conversation. So we have some great speakers today. We have Ben Phillips, who's a communication specialist and former campaigns and policy director at ActionAid. We have Atia Waris, who is the UN independent expert on foreign debt and a professor at the University of Nairobi. We have Kate Higgins, who is CEO of Cooperation Canada, and someone I've known for a long time in this space, working together on development. And from the OECD, I think Pilar was not able to join us today for various reasons. So we have Ida McDonald from the OECD Development Cooperation section. And then later on in the call, we'll have Mr. Mahmoud Mohaldin, who's the special advisor or special envoy of the Secretary General on financing the 2030 agenda, and he's known to many of you as having worked at the bank and in other places on development and climate finance. So with that, let me just start with just to say that this is an interactive conversation. I'm hoping that we can bring in some of you to speak up on the issues, ask questions, and engage with one another. If you have questions, you're also welcome to put them into the chat. Let's go ahead and get started. So I'm going to ask each of our speakers to just start us out with their thoughts on where we are and where we think we need to be going. I'm going to start with Ben Phillips, Communication Specialist and former Campaigns and Policy Director at ActionAid. Ben.
Thanks so much, Mintu. Can people see me and hear me? Great. So we are at a moment of profound challenge. ODA, financing for development, and multilateralism more broadly are in danger. And part of the challenge is a narrative one. It would be a mistake to view the events that are happening in the US as apart from the rest of the global north. They're at the far end, but they're at the far end of a wider trend. And they are a foreshadowing of a possible future direction for countries across the global north. I mean, let's take Belgium, for example. They just cut aid by 25%. Now, another part of the story is that DevEx called up the head of the Belgian aid agency to ask him about the reaction. And he said, "You're the only people who've called me." And he added, in the 70s and 80s and 90s, we had a generation very involved, but we lost the way in public support in the last 10 years. And then he concluded, "Even my closest friends still think we're helping poor people by constructing a well." Even Scandinavian countries are pulling back from their international obligations. Part of the challenge is that the dominant narrative on ODA and more broadly on financing for development is not going to work. Now, that narrative is felt by many ordinary people in the global north to be saying to them, A, you're all so fortunate, you're all doing so well, and B, because you're doing so well, you should sacrifice some of what you have and lose a bit for charity. Now, there's many people in the global north who feel that they're not doing so well. And in fact, the economic statistics shows that they're correct in that perception. Many of them feel, and in fact are, worse off in living standards than their parents. And many of them fear, perhaps correctly, that their kids will be living worse off than them. So they aren't won over by a frame that they perceive as about just making sacrifice and handing over money. Now, development people, understandably, tend to focus their efforts on the technical dimensions of development and be perhaps put less energy into the communication side. But the communication side is going to need more attention. Now, some might say, am I advocating spin over substance? Do I not think content matters? No, content does matter. But in a moment of existential risk, we have to recognize that development finance won't be very good if there's none of it. And so if there's a risk of it collapsing, and that collapse is powered by a narrative challenge, we have to win that narrative challenge. So what is the narrative that could work? Well, there isn't a single narrative alternative frame that would work everywhere. But one that I want to flag today, just because time is short, so I'll just flag one, is one that emphasizes that ODA is not a story of only people in the North contributing. In fact, in programs supported by ODA, developing country governments contribute through their public institutions, and communities in developing countries contribute too. And that frame should also emphasize that we all gain from ODA. I mean, take public health programs. When we fight infectious diseases, that's good for people in global North countries. It makes us safer. The frame would also recognize that multilateralism, including financing for development, including ODA, is not a nice to have. It's an essential. It would highlight that our world faces challenges so huge that we can only overcome them together, and opportunities so inspiring that we can only seize them together. And so we need to act together, including investing together, so that we win together. In this frame, no one is being asked only to be a helper. And it's clear that no one is only being helped. Everyone is co-contributing in a smart partnership from which everyone will gain protection from threats and everyone will win expanded opportunities. A few other positive things about this frame. Firstly, it's more accurate. This is actually how development finance works in practice. The northern sacrificial savior was never real. So this is not just a better spin, it's true. Secondly, it's not only going to work better in the global north, it's vastly preferred in the global south. Global South governments and organizations have long criticized the charity narrative and highlighted mutual contribution and mutual benefit. And thirdly, as well as shoring up support for financing for development overall, this frame will also reinforce efforts for positive policy reforms, including the efforts to increase low and middle income countries' voice in FfD processes and the ideas being developed on things like global public investment that are already being advocated for by people working on financing for development. And the same narrative could also be used to make the case on dropping debt and on tax justice and on other aspects of multilateralism, like ensuring that all countries respect international law. Now, this isn't a brand new idea, and there have been some communications on this already by governments and NGOs across global North countries. But the challenge is this: the legacy of the old unhelpful frame is so strong that this new frame can't simply be a line that's mentioned here or there. It needs to be carried right through, like Brighton Rock. So sometimes when professional advocates are asked about this, they remember, oh, we did a report on that. We had an op-ed on that. But the public in the North feels the weight of the old frame still. And so crucially, we need to displace that old frame. Narrative is not the only thing that matters. Other streams are vital, of course, but we do need to get this right. And there is no magic formula. It's complicated and it's challenging. We need to try a range, we need to experiment, take risks, because the bigger risk is sticking with what we have. And it needs work precisely because it's not easy. It needs collaboration, but we can win together. The headwinds at the moment are against us, but we can persevere and we can overcome. Really looking forward to the conversation. Thanks so much, Mentu.
Thanks so much, Ben. It is shocking to hear that when Belgium decided to do that, that only one journalist called them, and it happened to be DevX, whose job it is to follow this stuff. Thank you. Atia Waris, from a professor at University of Nairobi, and you an independent expert on foreign debt. Let's hear from you. Welcome.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure and an honor to be here. So I come from this space of fiscal law and policy. And what I do is I look at the interconnections between tax, debt, ODA, but also other forms of development assistance, public procurement laws, and how these all interact with government business, royalties, mineral deposits, and then how the link goes across to the other side and links into what it's spent on. And I have been watching the flow of finance cross from one side to the other, from the north to the south, from south to south, and in all the different trajectories that you can see across the world. And one of the things that you start to see almost immediately is this awkward negotiating space between these different member states when they're having these conversations. So if I give you an example of one, without mentioning a member state, of course, there were conversations around HIV and control of HIV. But the particular LDC in this particular scenario actually said they would rather spend money on education or schooling. And this is questions about priorities. Now, the back and forth negotiation on the ODA spending resulted in a very clear conditionality on how it's going to be spent, when it's going to be spent, and where it's going to be spent. And so this conversation led me to try and understand, what does this LDC have to put into the bucket as well? So this is not a situation of a one-directional spend. It's actually a creation of an entire economic space. You build the school, we're going to train the teachers that are going into it. You buy the MRI machines, we're going to pay for the technicians and help you figure it out. And there is failure every step of the way, but there is negotiating in that space also constantly and consistently. And because it has developed into an economic microcosm, there is a clear sharing in this space. Sometimes there is power imbalance, often there is power imbalance. Often there is direction in what is a priority of one country over the other, and it's about the power balance in between the two. But the narratives, which is what Ben is already talking about, is something I've been watching very carefully. And the narrative is, unfortunately, one of charity, but it isn't. It's actually, in the end, a coming together of a combination of factors to try and get to a certain end. sometimes not so comfortable, but always suboptimal at best. But that is what is happening. So for me, that is the one point that I really want to get across in this conversation. The second one is that there is equal contribution from everyone. So this is about a solidarity space, very much so, but it's also about contributions. But the third point is, and I looked desperately for some kind of a legal hook in which to look at this issue. The closest you can get is a 1970 General Assembly resolution that says that countries should contribute more and more. I'm happy to share the resolution number later. Now, this has translated into what has been a whole historical basis of contributions from different member states. But if I shift you across to the other spaces I've been, where there have been debates between incapacitating countries to collect better taxes so that countries can withdraw from aid, and then redirecting aid to help countries collect taxes better in order to allow them to exit the space, also leads us to the question that this is actually a trajectory that has been in place for quite a long time. If I take you across to a different example, which was the debates during climate finance in Baku and also earlier in Dubai, what you start to see is trade-offs, not on the creation of new finance, but actually on shifting finance bundles from one to the other. So not giving budgetary assistance, but rather shifting across to fulfill climate expectations. And if I take you back to my original argument about this is an economic microcosm that is benefiting countries and human beings in all parts of the world in a very circular way, then what you start to see is that as countries are redelineating their economic policies and projections, what they're doing on the ground is actually ensuring that there is better economy also on their side of the fence while trying to help. So they're trying to get some kind of a win-win situation. And I think for me, these are the three key issues that are coming out more and more, no matter what space I look at. I thank you very much for the time. I'm really looking forward to everybody else's conversation as well. Back to you.
Great. Thank you so much, Atia. Really helpful, especially as, you know, those of us in the global north who are challenged with making the case to citizens who see this as taxpayer dollars, as Ben was saying, that is going to other places where, you know, the citizens here feel like they're not well off enough to be able to do this as a kind of a charity agenda. And I think seeing that kind of empowerment is helpful. And so let me turn to Kate Higgins, who is CEO of Cooperation Canada. And Kate, you can also, if you don't mind, tell us what Cooperation Canada is and does, and would be grateful to hear your perspective, especially with what's been going on over there. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Mintu, and thank you everyone for being here and for the invitation. So I work for Cooperation Canada, and Cooperation Canada is the Canadian umbrella coalition group of Canadian international development and humanitarian organizations. We have over 100 members. They are all charities and non-for-profits working in international cooperation, and they're based across Canada and are working globally. So that is kind of the space that I sit in, and the positionality I have, or some of the perspectives and reflections that I will share come from that space. So really, really interesting reflections. And Atia, I have to say, after what has been a bit of a challenging few weeks in the political context here in Canada, I just really appreciated the calls for solidarity and the framing around that in this moment. And it's a really important reminder for people like me as we're feeling pushed to move into very transactional messaging on the role of international cooperation, to really, really be reminded and grounded in that importance. Ben also made a really important reflection around what has happened in the US with the very abrupt action around US aid and his reflections around that potentially foreshadowing what could happen in other contexts. The leader of the official opposition here in Canada, who is quite a long way ahead in the polls, made a comment on Monday that he would make massive cuts to the Canadian aid budget. So that's kind of where I'm coming from, and that's the week that I have kind of been living. We have a federal election that will come very soon here in Canada. We have very close proximity to the US. We have threats of very significant tariffs coming to Canada from the US, which is completely dominating the dialogue, the discussion, and the conversation. And there's deep concerns around the economic security of Canadians. Now, I'm sharing this because we're trying to break through the dialogue here in this country in that sort of political and economic context. And what has been somewhat positive, I don't think that's the right word, but has given me some hope, is there has been quite a lot of media attention around what has happened in the US and the abrupt nature of US aid cuts. It's really challenging for us to get media coverage here in Canada around the amazing work that many of you do around the world. It's very challenging, and yet I have had invitations to be on the biggest news, television broadcast programs this week, last night and tonight, which is something I have never been asked to do in my capacity and in this role. So the question for us, and the question for those of us that care about international cooperation, global solidarity, the financing for development agenda, is how do we leverage this moment where there is some media interest, and where, frankly, my sense is many Canadians would not want to see the sort of abrupt slash and burn that has happened in the US happen to the Canadian aid program. How do we kind of leverage that moment? And how do we do that in a way that will cut through, that will engage with Canadians, that will frankly engage the many, many thousands of Canadians that support international cooperation in many different ways, whether it's through advocacy, partnerships, whether it's through donations, whether it's through relationships that they have. We have a very large immigrant diaspora, incredibly vibrant community here in this country. So how do we leverage that at this moment? And how do we do that in a way that aligns with our values, our beliefs, and the direction that we know we must go in international cooperation? I noticed Temriz Khan, who is a friend and someone who is now living in the same city as me, made a really important comment here around kind of how do we kind of do this in a way, yeah, that aligns with the direction we need to go. So I think I'll leave it there. I think there's a real challenge for us and something we must grapple with now around how we manage this very short term, what feels like very urgent context. But how do we do that in a way that kind of aligns with the very important work we need to do on shifting power in international cooperation, in solidarity in the context of financing for development? How does that urgency and that deep need for change kind of sit together, and how do we leverage that to, in my country, engage Canadians to believe and support and engage in the type of international assistance, global solidarity work that I think those of us on this call all deeply, deeply support and believe in. Thanks, Mintu.
Kate, if you don't mind, let me just follow up with that, because I'd love for you to try to answer your own question. And you started out by saying that in this moment, sometimes it feels like the transactional message of what, or maybe another way to put it is the direct national interest case. Those of us who are advocates feel like we have to make that as opposed to the solidarity or mutual interest case, because it's just so dire, and we need to do something that is going to appeal right to those who might only see it as a sort of a national interest issue, or might only be swayed if it were a core national security or national interest issue. How do you balance that? And are there messages that you found in recent years that's been helpful in making the case in Canada?
So I'd be super open to advice and feedback.
By the way,
especially-
that question is not just for Kate. Anyone with, we're going to open the floor up soon. So anyone with ideas on that, go ahead.
I mean, I look, I've been trying to kind of make both arguments kind of in the same sense, and to say that, this sort of work, whether it's kind of emergency humanitarian assistance or kind of global solidarity investments, is not only the right thing to do, but the strategic thing to do. It aligns with Canadian values. It is kind of part of kind of who we want to be as a country, but it's also deeply in our self-interest to step up in a very kind of complex geopolitical context. Countries like Canada do want to have partnerships and do need to have a diversity of partners around the world. And so that is the argument that I've been using. Really interesting. I was pressed in a really interesting way by a journalist last night on kind of Russia and China stepping in and what does that mean. So I think that sort of messaging is really breaking through. So I think, yeah, I mean, the best I have done is kind of to make kind of both arguments and really say that it is not only the right thing to do, but it is also in our interests and it's strategic. I think that's kind of where we're at.
Thanks so much. I was having a conversation with someone who is on this call, I won't name them unless they want to name themselves, about also reaching out to audiences who, especially in this country, so the United States, as Canada and others are, it's an immigrant country. So much of the population, have family who originated in other parts of the world, and that there is a case for development cooperation and support to other countries, just in the fact that that people have strong ties with other parts of the world in a country like the United States, and yet we're not reaching out to them. We may be reaching out to the same, sort of 1 or 2% of informed publics who we expect might be the ones to appeal to, but not the broader publics. And so I wonder also how we might open up this narrative and reach out to those who should be brought into these conversations, but aren't necessarily. Let me turn to the OECD, Ida McDonnell. And I'm sorry that Pila is not able to be here, but I had a conversation with Ida earlier this week, and so really grateful to have you here from the Development Cooperation Unit at the OECD. You guys have been working a lot on narratives. In fact, I think you have a whole report, which maybe someone can put that into the chat for us to take a look at. You guys have looked at how to make the case in the OECD countries for aid. Can you talk a little bit about that, and then maybe just more broadly how you're seeing these issues now and the challenges that you're facing?
Thank you very much, Mintu. Delighted to be here to participate in this very timely discussion, and regrets from my director that I worked directly with her in her office, and we very much worked together on these issues. So I do hope and believe that I'll be channeling some of her, hopefully, energy, but also perspectives on this. So as you mentioned, narratives and communication with taxpayers, voters, youth, is actually very much very present and top of discussions among the member states of the Development Assistance Committee, but also very much with other providers of development cooperation, civil society and think tanks, and we're very happy to be part of discussions on that. But what I would want to say is that this is a recurring question that keeps coming up around how do we make the case for whether it's aid or a a broader thinking and that shift that Ben and Atya and Kate and everybody talks about away from aid to partnership and international cooperation. So I'm going to focus in on some of those points, and then I'll come out broader at the end, if that's okay. We have the privilege also of coordinating a network of communicators from across OECD aid agencies. And actually, I discussed with the team lead on that as well to draw some of the experiences that they have brought as aid agencies engaging in communications, and wanted to share some of that. And I guess the first point we wanted to make was that we do actually see a convergence among the communicators, but also in terms of the more strategic conversations around narratives, is that the narratives really will need to build on what connects us and on the challenges that all humans face, no matter where they live, and the solidarity links across that. Narratives that divide the world into rich and poor, us and them, do not work. And I think this insight begs a deeper question here about also how we provide development cooperation and what it focuses on, and how we talk about that in terms of report on that, and the emphasis we often play on how much aid we give and the levels of that aid versus what that aid achieves. And I've been reading some work by Angus Deaton on global inequality, including inequality in many OECD countries. And I think he gives us food for thought that also colleagues have got here. First is that beneficiaries in a way of aid do not vote in the donor countries. And how we think about poverty, for example, how should we think about poverty in the world in light of poverty in the countries that also provide ODA? If we shift from charity at home to charity abroad, what does that also mean in terms of our engagement with citizens? And I think that's a very important question. In terms of the lessons from the communicators at the coalface, one, and it just builds from the last point, the aid charity narrative doesn't work anymore. It upsets people at home, and it even upsets more audiences in partner countries. So many organizations we've seen have rebranded their work to more pragmatic win-win, mutual benefits, partnership-focused narratives, but we still see others focusing still really very much on the aid narrative. And so there really is a very diversity, I would say, across countries, and there is a risk with the partnership narrative that the partnership talk needs to be matched with the partnership walk, and rebranding itself alone will not work. Second, on national interest. So pivoting to the national interest narrative doesn't seem to work either with citizens. It doesn't resonate with supporters of development cooperation themselves. So the converted, if you like, those who are the support base. And there's no evidence that it actually wins new supporters. So there's food for thought there, really, in terms of how far do you go on that? And the last lesson from the communicators is around the communicators themselves, and how we refine our approach to communication and storytelling. There's no narrative on development without the underlying facts and stories, and without the narrators themselves. Who are these narrators and how are they trusted? And that's a very important message. And so on my closing points, I want to come out to the big picture. So how do we work on narratives today? And kind of where we are at. How are we going to be credible and legitimate in the eyes of the public, but also our partners? And a first takeaway that we wanted to share is that we have to think about trust in government. We have seen since the financial crisis in 2009, in the OECD tracking of trust in governments in OECD countries, that amid economic concerns, no or low trust in government outweighs trust in government. So we have to think about this trust element. And perceptions of having a say in government actions influence that trust more so than socioeconomic and demographic issues do. So we have a concern there. We have to think about trust. Second, on the finance gaps, we are talking, and we launched a report earlier this week, a global outlook on financing for development. And we thought the gaps are phenomenal, and we're going into FfD4. We want to make a case to mobilize more financing beyond ODA as well. There is a risk that we actually overwhelm populations when we talk about the trillions in terms of the gaps. And how do we actually engage? Is that narrative the right narrative to really make the case? Needs are rising, but they're rising everywhere. And so that comes back to not prioritizing necessarily one over the other. And the last point is around effectiveness. We cannot make the case unless we can show that what we're achieving works, that we get away from the inputs, we focus on the outputs and the impacts. But in that, we have to really, really manage for the paradox in public opinion surveys that on the one hand, people support ODA, on the second, that they believe it is highly ineffective and lost to corruption. And so the aid business, the development cooperation business, needs to tackle this question right now. And needs to face up. We say we're the most audited in the world, but yet that perception prevails around corruption. And so we need to engage in those issues, but we also need to finally engage with citizens to craft that narrative. No narrative for them without them is what I would make a case for. I'll stop there. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Ida. I'm really struck by, just in the conversation that I just had with Kate, your point that in looking into this, you found that the national interest argument didn't work with the converted, but it also didn't work with bringing in new audiences. Are you able to give us a little bit more, can you elaborate a little bit more on that, including when this was done and then what kinds of did you test specific messages? And by the way, I don't mean to have you delve through your report, so maybe we can come back to that in a bit, but I do think that's useful, because right now it does feel like we're in this moment where it's so urgent that making a core national security argument or a national interest argument seems to be winning the day. And I'm seeing now my colleagues putting some messages into the chat. So you are also welcome to raise your hand and speak up. Let me see if Mahmoud is on. I see he's on, but I'm not sure if he's actually listening in yet. He was going to be able to join a little bit later. If not, Mahmoud, let me go to the room and see how you all are seeing these issues. What messages have you seen could potentially work? And then any reactions to how we might shift or change or strengthen this narrative to increase development cooperation. All right, so I have, Mahmoud, you are on.
Yeah, very much so.
Okay, great, there you are. Okay, so if you don't mind, David and Dina, just pause for 1 second and let me hand the floor over to Mahmoud, who is the SG's, the Secretary General's special advisor or envoy on financing the 2030 agenda. And he was at the World Bank for a while. He's worked on climate finance. I think many of you know him in many of his leadership roles, and really grateful to have him here. We worked on FfD 3 together, and so grateful to have him here. By the way, I should also say, Mahmoud and Homi Karas are putting out a piece today on 4 priorities for success in this year's FfD. I think it's going to be published sometime today, and if so, then we will send that link around. Mahmoud, go ahead.
Right. Thank you so much, Minthu, for the kind introduction. I followed the interventions from the very beginning. I liked everything that colleagues shared, especially with what Ben Phillips started us with at the very beginning. I think some of us have been very much confusing uncertainty with existential risk. And I think what he used, those strong words about the existential risk and the kind of preparations to deal with this particular situation, not just in the prospects of ODA, but the implications of shrinking ODA space without alternative. And the other thing is basically, it seems that we started the whole discussions from the MDGs back in the day with more dependence on ODA, that this is going to be solving the problem with a bit of partnerships from the private sector and the MDBs or the multilateral development banks, which are, as we know, very much dependent on ODA. Now, on the FfD3 that you mentioned, Mintu, it was the era of partnerships, public-private partnerships, leveraging private sector finance. It's the ODA money, that's the billions of the ODA that's going to be bringing the trillions to bridge the gap of finance. 2015 was full of aspirational goals and targets and spirit. The SDGs were aspirational. We had the Paris Agreement. And in July in Addis of 2015, matters related to means of implementation, why they should be more technical, they didn't really miss the opportunity of being aspirational to make sure that it is matching the goals that were in preparation. As we know, the goals were blessed a couple of months after Addis. So we are very much, and you mentioned the joint piece I'm doing with Homi, and for those who are familiar with his work, including with the Center of Global Development as well. Some of us actually in the regions of Africa, Mediterranean, and Arab countries, they read the Center of Global Development report, which is available on the future of ODA and the different pathways as a nice way to bury the old system. As simple as that. It's basically the end of ODA as we know it. It is not a temporary gap because of some political tensions here or some particular wars or because of differences in attitudes of particular governments. It's very much reflecting changes in the structure, the policy, and the perspective. It is funny because the very countries I'm mentioning of these regions have been always seeing ODA, some countries of the global south, that it has been working in the interest of the contributors and the donors, not in the interest of the beneficiaries and in the kind language our colleague used from OECD as the partners. So what kind of changes then of the interest of the contributors, of the taxpayers' money, that was it there but not realized, or these interests shifted, or the gains are not really matching the kind of cost, or there are other means to obtain the same kind of benefits beyond ODA through transactions or deals or trade. We're in the era as well from aid to trade, from countries like mine, which graduated from more dependence on aid in the past to believe on the merits of trade, investment, partnership, technical cooperation. What I'm trying to solve here of a problem is basically, first one, is it a temporary one? Is it an issue of a political cycle or war that we hope and pray they would end, or some sort of implications on budgets of contributing countries of OECD DAC that is going to be over, and then we are going to be seeing a better trend? Or some of us, as it happened in the case of the replenishment of the Green Climate Fund, that I was very much in the center of it. I was basically the facilitator of that one. And actually, in my open reports, I say, well, again, these are strong signals that this is very much the end of ODA as we know it. And countries that had been on the lead of supporting the likes of the Green Climate Fund or IDA, they need to be lobbied in order to do what they in the past used to do the lobbying for. So this is just talking about pledges, not delivery. There is a changing landscape almost in everything, not just on that. On trade, there are more active trading partners than the one that we had in the past in emerging markets of countries of the global south. South-South cooperation and investments is much stronger than in the past. People are saying, well, some countries in the emerging markets world, in the global south, can step in using some of the good principles of disclosure, transparency, impact of OECD DAC, and they can do more on that front. Will that, and this is another question here, this is my second question, if that the change of CBDR, the common but differentiated responsibility, as we know it, or it is just using it with a kind of a dynamic perspective with different players. This is the second point. Third is basically borrowing from my good friend and colleague, Mark Lowcock. who's been always complaining about the lack of finance, not just for development, but for climate, and in his own domain when he was responsible for ODA, the issues related to humanitarian finance. So he had been always saying it could be the act of self-interest for those who have questions about the value of money going through ODA, is to serve their purposes, to protect their land, to protect their borders, and to minimize the negative spillovers from having more poverty or more hardship and more forced migration. That kind of common sense approach, and again, going back to the issue of Ben and what he said, it's the substance rather than the spin that we need really to consider when we're talking about it. That kind of common sense, absent or not. Then I think here we need really to look into matters of beyond ODA, because ODA in many cases was leading to trade cooperation, technical cooperation, convergence of standards and norms. So there could be many changes and compromises. I'm happy for countries like mine, middle-income countries, to be less dependent on ODA, having a bigger role for the DRM, domestic resource mobilization, for private sector contributions, and other means. But there are other countries that are not ready for that, and there will be some serious implications. Happy to come back in the discussion about what we can do more in this space. And please read that note that I prepared with my good friend Homi.
Thank you. I was just trying to see if it was online already. Homi sent me a pre-draft, but we will send that link around as soon as it's up. I think it'll be on the Brookings website. All right, Mahmoud, thank you so much. That was excellent. I think we have a few comments in the chat, and I'd encourage those folks to also raise their hand and speak up. But let me go to David. Go ahead and introduce yourself.
Thanks, Mintu. So I'm David Wright. I'm currently on sabbatical. Up until June of last year, I was the Chief Operating Officer with Save the Children International. I've 30 years in the sector, so obviously seen a lot of change throughout the years. I just want to make a few comments about what was said, and also talk about what I think is a prerequisite for the sector as we kind of confront these challenges that are facing us at the moment. I thought the speakers were great. So well done. I really enjoyed listening to all of you. Ben, we worked together back in the day with Save the Children. I think you're spot on with your reframing. I think that's the way to go. And I thought at DIA, you made a very important point about solidarity, which I think for me, this is the key that will help get us out of this mess. And Ida, you developed it even further by talking about the importance of what connects us rather than what divides us, and that unity is the way forward. And I think if we focus on solidarity and unity, this is what's going to get us out of this mess. When I think back to the kind of history of the sector, which for me at least, and I'm not an academic, but for me it's kind of the beginning of the 20th century, and this sense of internationalism. People ordinary people on one side of the world reaching out to ordinary people on the other side of the world, trying to work together to make the world a better place. Even going back further than that, during the Irish famine, you had the Choctaw Native Americans in Oklahoma who had heard about the famine in Ireland and actually reached out and sent aid to Ireland at that time. And so it's this human need to help others. I think that's what we've got to focus on, and focus on it as international solidarity, and get rid of the divisions, because this is what has done us a lot of harm in the past. I remember saying to Inger Ashing, the CEO of Save the Children International, about 5 years ago, I said, we've always been used to being under attack from the right, but we've been under attack from the left as well. I use the left in the kind of broadest meaning, not Marxist or anything, but people who are liberal or progressive. And so the whole sector has been coming under attack by being paternalistic and and not respecting sovereignty and all that. And it's not that those points are incorrect. In fact, technically a lot of them are correct. And but I think we definitely need to address them, but not we've emphasized them so much, and particularly the word decolonization. And I come from a country which was colonized for 800 years, and I think that word decolonization just shouldn't be associated with the aid sector, because decolonization was a violent process, and we are talking about different things. But the constant repetition of these terms undermines, I think, our self-confidence and our self-belief in this whole sector. And so while other sectors continued on, global finance, full of self-belief, full of self-confidence, the arms industry, full of self-confidence, self-belief, the mining industry, never questioning themselves, keeping on. We held ourselves back by overthinking stuff, questioning ourselves too much. Of course, we need to do continuous improvement. We need to make sure there's no paternalism or whatever. Again, I like what the speakers were saying. It has to be, we're all in this together. Mahmoud's points were great. South-South collaboration, but it just needs to be ordinary people, no matter where they are in the world, working with ordinary people in other parts of the world, to fight against the man, as it were. And we need to get back to that fundamental idea. Thank you.
Thank you so much, David. That was great. Dina, go ahead and introduce yourself too. Good to see you here.
Yeah, thank you so much. That's extremely thought-provoking. So my name is Dina Fakusa. I work for a German private foundation, one of the biggest foundations in Germany. And I worked for more than 20 years on the MENA region, rather as a recipient of ODA. So maybe a couple of thoughts. I totally agree that we need to change the narrative and we need to communicate more about the interconnectedness of things, in the global north. But I also think that, the narrative was never really honest, because it was never about charity. And this is backfiring now. Because, the country like Germany had clear security, economic, trade interest when it offered ODA. And we were never honest about it. And that's why I think we need more honesty. I'm not sure really people are open to more solidarity, but I think they need to see how this is connected to their own well-being, and why when Germany or the UK or invests in another country, why this is connected to their well-being. Yeah, if it's in climate change, health issues, economic, social issues that could also, push back a bit the migration wave. So they need to understand this more. So I'm really skeptical about the solidarity dimension, although I totally agree that it's necessary, but I think it won't sell. People are so outraged. And maybe connected to this, I think in parallel, what is also necessary is, a shift in the economic model pursued by many countries in, whether Europe or the US, because, people are facing more hardship. They're working their entire life. They still end up in poverty. They still, be dependent on state services. So something is wrong with the model, and people are really feeling that hardship now. And that's why there's no really willingness or like an understanding to invest somewhere else or to take taxpayers' money to other countries. So I think they're more complex, I know, but I think it's needed. And maybe the third thing is, and I do think that sadly it's becoming more urgent, but actually the issue of effectiveness was always a problem with ODA. And I think what is necessary, I guess, today is that you have to have a much smarter division of work between the different countries, whether in Europe or the US. We have less money. Okay, we need to focus, but how can we complement each other? Because what we've been seeing for decades is we didn't have like this donor harmonization, we didn't have a coordination. So there's like spreading too thin, not being aware of what others are doing. But this is even more important now, and I think it's very necessary. And the last point, maybe, I'm not sure whether China and Russia really will step in. So Russia definitely will not step in to what US aid, the vacuum that is left. Maybe China. But I think because everyone is a bit hysterical now, I feel, oh, China and Russia, they're going to be there. But I think with Russia, it's really different. With China, yes, but still, I mean, they do very different things, like in a very different way. So what is going to be missing is not going to be replaced really by their engagement, but of course their influence will increase in general. Yeah, just thank you very much.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Dina. Super helpful. I have Jonathan Glennie, my dear friend. Go ahead, Jonathan.
Thanks, Bintu. Thanks, everyone. Great meeting. Really, really enjoyed those presentations and all the comments. Just on that China thing, I'll make a prediction. You know, this is not the end of US money in the international arena by any means. Yeah, the reason why large-scale international public finance is going to continue is fundamentally, it's not what I want, but I think it's what is true. It's fundamentally because major powers will see the importance of major spending abroad for their own interests. Clearly, we understand that in the China case. It's like so obvious, no one ever denies it. And yet when it comes to Europe and North America, we're unclear. Okay, it's clear. If international public finance makes a serious comeback in the US, it will be because it is considered to be large scale, majorly in the interests of the country itself. And we can discuss those interests in various ways, and that's what I want to do actually right now. But you know, it's a good thing that China is stepping in. Like I know that people have to kind of go to the Hill and kind of meet Marco Rubio and all that stuff, but the narrative is that the US versus China narrative is a really, really poor narrative for us as internationalists to be taking. And let me just explain what I think the national interest case is, because I agree with what you said, mostly Ida, but I think at one point you said there's no evidence that the national interest case works for the general public. I think what you meant by that, if I might kind of finesse it, is that the tight, self-interested, it's in our interest to beat the US or to beat China, we'll beat them by doing this, there is no evidence that works with the general public. Now, it may work, but what you said, I think, is precisely correct. There is no evidence that it works. But what there is evidence for, a lot of evidence, and I shared one piece, which is a really detailed piece of work done by Black Sands a couple of years ago, with 20,000 respondents in 7 G7 countries. And I've also just been looking at Canada in quite a lot of detail, as Kate knows, and it's the same there. Yes, the charity and kindness thing does actually work well with the general public, but linking it, and someone said this really well, linking it to local interests and your own world, it works and is crucially important. And there's tons of evidence that suggests it's a really key finding of the Black Sands thing. When you're out there campaigning for this international spend, you have to link it to where people are at. And that includes inflation, that includes food prices and energy, that includes health, that includes all the things that people are right to care about. It's not quite the same, is it, as maybe we think about national interest as a government thing and self-interest, but people's own lives and their interests. And that's what I think we should be calling mutual interest. So, and it's not a dirty word. It is a good thing to think about our world as mutually dependent and interdependent. It doesn't take away from the need for us to continue to be thoughtful and kind people. And by the way, I'll just end here. Something we just forget because it's so blatant and horrific. But the grossest thing of all of what Marco Rubio and Donald Trump are doing is taking away values entirely from the equation. No government, no, I've never seen that so blatantly. This is the richest country in the world, and it's taken everything purely to interests. And I'm not saying, and I don't think anyone is calling for more emphasis on mutual interest, is saying we should only focus on the national interest at all. And in fact, we should absolutely remind the rich world that it is their obligation and their duty and their, I almost said joy, that's not quite the right word, but the right thing to do. And the fact that people, you know, the US government is now standing up and just demonstrating a total lack of concern for anyone else is truly awful. But I mean, I know we all think that and know that. It's just, we'd hardly say it now because it's so kind of built in or caked in or whatever the word is.
Yeah, thanks so much, Jonathan. In fact, I was just seeing this morning that the new Secretary of Defense has gone to NATO and said that you can't shoot values and that hard power is where it's at. Okay, so let's see, who else do we have? And then let me also, for our speakers, I want to just put you on notice because I do want to come back to some of your comments and have you reflect on what you've already heard. Let me see if I can say this correctly. Timraiz Khan. please introduce yourself. And if you're able to turn on your video, that would be great. And I
Yes, hi.
probably botched your name, so please say your name.
No, you haven't botched my name. You said it correctly. It's Temriz Khan. Thanks very much. A few of you on this call may know me. Kate, as she said, yes, we know each other well. I'm sort of the disruptor in these conversations. At least I'm seen as a disruptor. And I just want to bring up one point that I just put in the chat as well as a response. And that is, with all due respect, you're talking about that part of the world that you want to help, or where the money is going to, and which is the raison d'être of ODA, you're sort of speaking about us as if we're not there, as if we don't exist, as if we don't have any opinions about this matter, as if we are going along with everything that you say here. And I find that problematic because a lot of us have opinions that differ greatly from what's being spoken here. And that's because we don't get a lot of the opportunities to speak or to be heard. A lot of us are subservient to ODA in our countries because of, our political histories. A lot of us are subservient because of foreign policy interests. And I don't think foreign policy interests have ever been divorced from ODA. I think that narrative has been coming right from the start. And a lot of us in the Global South as recipients, we know that to be true because we've experienced it. So for instance, we'll get ODA if we allow, Western countries such and such allocations or interests in our own countries, whether it's extractives, whether it's allowing them to set up military bases in our countries. And I'm from Pakistan, so I've experienced that firsthand. So a lot of our perspectives are based on these experiences, which happen to be true. And in this current scenario, the assumption is that we are also absolutely mortified and horrified about the fact that, what is happening. Now, I don't want to undermine that, but I think the perspectives you may find from our part of the world, wherever that might be in the Global South, would differ. And I would just urge people to open your minds up, excuse me, to other perspectives, which I think are coming up. I think a lot of us in the Global South are seeing what's happened recently as an opportunity for ourselves to build our own capacity and for ourselves to develop ourselves on our terms. Now, none of that is easy. I don't even know if it'll ever happen, given how and where we stand. But I think when you speak about narratives, please don't speak about us as if we are the other, as if we don't exist. We very much exist. We're there. You're talking about us for your interests, but we have interests as well, and we'd like to speak up for that. So I don't represent the Global South in its entirety. I barely represent my own country, Pakistan. I know there are a lot of differing opinions even within Pakistan about ODA. I've been part of the sector there for over 25 years. But I would just urge that in conversations like this, we also realize that there are other conversations that may be happening in those countries that you call ODA recipients. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Temriz. That was great. And I think, let me just also reiterate some of the comments that others have made here, that we recognize that the Global South it doesn't also buy into this narrative that's been put out there. And so thank you for reminding us of that. I think some of our speakers have also said that as well. I think it's really important to focus in on, at least for this conversation, the purpose here was to look at, if we do believe in life-saving humanitarian and development assistance, how do we shore up support among the citizens who see this as taxpayer dollars, and that we want to make sure that that can continue, but that eventually this is what we're fundamentally talking about, is allowing the Global South to develop on their own terms, and for countries to develop their own plans and develop on their own terms. Let me turn to Eloise Todd, my dear friend. Go ahead, Eloise, and introduce yourself to the group.
Hi, thank you, Mintu, and thanks for convening this call. I'm Eloise Todd. I run Pandemic Action Network, which started at the beginning of COVID and now works on the root causes of future threats including we do engage in some ODA fights. I really really thank everyone for the rich comments. And what I wanted to say was, when I hear these conversations, it makes me think that when there's many threads mixed together that maybe need untangling a little bit. So of course we need to have a good narrative and sell it in a way that works, but I don't think we should confuse that with the fundamental reboot that we need to see with the policy. It's very hard to sell a policy that is in formation or doesn't quite exist yet, or a way of doing things. So I think that's part of the confusion, because, and to sorry, when last speaker's point, I really, we have to start with, we talk a good game about, respecting the global south and all of this, but there's still a sort of ideas game where people want to be the ones with the sort of coming up with it. So it's more about the process that we need to decide on. There might be different ideas and methods in every country. There might be slightly different ways of doing it that suit those communities, the decision makers. And so we also have to check ourselves in the way we even talk about this, I think. And how can we apply some good principles and values to the way that we show up for those conversations? But I do think there is, we're obviously in a crisis situation. Someone very sensibly said about was it Ben, about the US being, the furthest exaggeration of things are happening badly in Europe as well, just not quite with the same sort of petrol and match, but it is happening. We do need to fight those fights and, sort of do the best that we can with different tools. And I think we need to try different messaging, and you sort of need to do what works for that political family. I think that we've got a real crisis in advocacy, honestly. I think that we've sort of built a movement that is decent when times are sort of good and people need nudging in the right direction. I think that kind of, not to be cruel to ourselves, but I think that we sort of work well when things need a bit of a push. I don't think we're equipped at all for this kind of total destruction. And also, even in the face of, to the point that you said about the Belgian cuts, even in the face of such slashing, people are even more nervous to speak out and criticize, because they sort of want to hold on to the tiny bit of favor that they can curry with the contact that they have. And I think that's the wrong approach as well. It's almost like NGO opposition has become a radicalized thing, so that only fringe super left or super progressive groups are seen as doing that, which then makes people in the sort of mainstream a little bit impotent, quite honestly. So I think we've got to think about our tactics. I think we've got to think about our strategy for the short term. And to be honest, let's try things, let's do what works. But we mustn't get so lost in that we lose the fight on the longer term strategy, getting the policies right. And that means getting the way of doing business and the way of funneling money right in those countries, that is genuinely led by people from those countries. If we're talking about what do we do with the limited public money that we have, whether it's domestic or international, and how do we cut all of the, multiple ways we make countries like dance to a tune. They're so busy doing grant administration and applications. There's very little the capacity to actually, deliver. So I think there's so many themes there that we can grapple with. So really appreciate I hope I haven't said anything that's offensive, just trying to be cut to the chase of untangle policy from narrative, untangle short term from long term. And also, one last thing I wanted to say was we have to get better at getting ahead of the trends that we see. So there's this sort of descent into money only really being for like development becoming humanitarian, really, like this kind of, we've seen it in Europe, that the sort of cushions and the the flexibility instruments and the, you know, whether it's Ukraine or refugees or whatever it is, that kind of money is going to increase at the expense of the longer term. So how can we sort of not be shocked by that, but put that in the mix and really think about those tensions and how we get ahead of them when we're thinking about how to deliver at a country level? And what do things like AI and increased security threats mean for our work on this agenda? Sorry, I spoke a little bit too long.
No, Eloise, thank you so much. This is great. And clearly we need to be doing things differently, not just on obviously the narrative, but as many of you have already talked about, the foreign policy and the substance. Let me go back to our speakers in reverse order, unless there's anybody else who wants to chime in. Let me go back to our speakers. So Mahmoud first, and then I think Atia had to leave, and then we'll go to Ida, Kate, and then Ben to wrap up. Mahmoud, reactions, comments to what you've heard, additional thoughts? I just saw you flash on the screen and now you're gone. Okay. Okay, we will go back to Mahmoud in case he's able to come back. Then let me go to, oh, there you are, Mahmoud.
I'm facing some technical difficulty here. Yeah, I followed the discussion, and I like to put the whole thing now in the current debate that we have for the finance for development and Sabila. And it's beyond the narrative, really. It's more on the substance and what is going to be remaining of what we have today. Yep. And what could be the role of the new contributors, especially from the global south and the high-income countries, and whether we can really see more leveraging of whatever we have today that can really speak for itself about impact. And governments that had some particular perspective in revising the whole thing, either for political reasons or concerns about impact, I think the issues here need really to be more granular in terms of communication about the success and failures in the field of many of the operations. And I think we have a great deal, especially on lies coming from IDA, many of the vertical funds, that they can really go and defend not just the legacy, but what they can really be doing in the future. And the other thing, basically for countries that are going to be short of funding soon, they need really the kind of help and support that can really get them to incentivize some areas that have been impacted badly by the way that some of flows associated with ODA didn't follow the simple rule, that simple rule that money should be going on system and on budget and monitoring the impact, as simple as that. And that had made a good differentiation between the success of some of the models that we have in existence. Perhaps because of my old World Bank work, I'm more biased to the good discipline of IDA and its impact. But again, those countries, especially in the global south, that have been complaining about ODA or parts of it to be colonialism and dominance under a new name, they need really to come as well with ideas, because many of the things are going now to the drawing board on how can we make priorities for the future. That will not be resolved in June in Seville, but this is a kind of an ongoing discussion, because definitely we need to really to realize that we are in a new system, a new approach. It's not ODA as we know it. Parts of that is good, parts of that is bad, but we need really to be more pragmatic by providing solutions rather than moaning on what happened and what's happening. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mahmoud. Wonderful. And I hope that actually one takeaway from this is that there's clearly interest in this. I know there's lots of other groups working on this, ODI, CGD, the Mahmoud and Homi and others at Brookings, Jonathan and others, but I think it might be helpful for us to to revisit this and maybe bring folks together to see what could we get out of FfD that starts to lay out that path for this new system that you were just talking about. Let me go to Ida next, the OECD.
Thank you very much, and it's been absolutely brilliant listening to all the interventions, and to, you know, there's clearly so much cohesiveness in some respects in this group, and in terms of the ideas that are coming out, and see what we can do now going forward. I really think we have to look to the future. I'd like to pick up on just some points that Dina and Temriz have mentioned on narrative. So the first to Dina on the narrative not being honest. I think that's absolutely right. That we really need to do an honesty check on the narrative and the narratives. There is the unsaid of what international development cooperation is doing, and then there are the elements that we think the supporters of aid should hear about it, and we tell them that one. And then actually then there are surprises afterwards, because other things happen when we show results. So we've had a tendency in the international community, and sorry to be a bit bold in saying this, to really oversell ODA. We oversell it in terms of its objectives. It's going to eliminate extreme poverty. It's going to get zero hunger. It's going to fight climate change, etc. And then, so we create this big movement around it. And then what we've managed to show is some really good results, but not at that scale. And there's a real misperception then that's created among public opinion about, well, actually, what is its role? So I think some more candidness there. And I wanted to there relate with Jonathan's point. He's absolutely right. First of all, I totally agree. There are many interests, and you can recast national interest in terms of sustainable development, in terms of global health, prevention, etc. They are in our interests. But of course, where we get dragged down is that critique of aid in terms of very narrow, self-interested elements. And I would really, from knowing the international development cooperation world quite well, from seeing how our members work and peer reviews, there is a little bit of that, but it's not really that. Like when you look at the programming and the work that's done, there's amazing work being done. And we don't manage to tell that story very well. And when we do at some of those national interests, and I can share a report from the DevCon group, when they started to look at drivers of illegal migration and say, oh, ODA will stem migration, the challenge is that you then create the expectation that migration will be stemmed. But in fact, all the research and evidence around migration flows go completely against that narrative in terms of how it works. And so again, are we being honest about it? So I think really all of us have to have a real rethink there. And that links to the point around the model. The models. There is no model of international development cooperation. There are multiple models. But when we come together internationally, we try and make it all simple and kind of generalize. And the devil is certainly in the detail. But to come back to Temriz, I think there has been a major movement, especially since COVID, around really how we are conveying international cooperation and getting away from us and them. And there's one point that I really wanted to flag around how we convey an empowered image identity of our partners, who are people all over the world. And linked with that, I think I'm really quite inspired by the Pledge for Change that has been done by the INGOs, linking really with how they're going to shift power. But a key message of behavior change for the INGOs, and that links with the humanitarian aid imagery that we're getting still around charity, is about authentic storytelling. And having real people telling their stories and moving away from that. And so that's a big, I think, part of the reboot that we need. And then lastly, on going to FfD4, I think that we need to look beyond ODA and FfD4. It can deliver on some elements, but we really need, as Mahmoud said, to really think in a more granular way about where the needs are for concessional finance versus blended finance, and how we work with South-South cooperation and trilateral cooperation. We are doing it, and we can do more of that. And so there is, I think, some hope there. And we really need to work in a realistic way. The billions from trillions narrative doesn't work. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. Okay, Kate, I realize we only have a couple more minutes, so if you're able to stay on for a couple more minutes, I do want to get Kate and Ben in for final comments. Go ahead, Kate.
Thanks, Mintu. I'll be really brief. Thanks for a really great conversation. Maybe just three points. I think we need to continue investing in the narratives and working out what works. I think we need to continue investing in the ways of then kind of engaging people on those narratives. And my third point is I think we need to better invest in conversations like these and ways of us sharing in quick, responsive, reactive ways. What is working? How is it working? What is experience? If I think of my particular context here in Canada, we know that many of our European partners are facing similar contexts. How are we doing a better job of learning from what has and hasn't worked in those contexts, I think is really, really important. And then I think the final point of just really making sure we're investing in making sure that the people that are at the center of this work are centered in the work. So thanks. Back to you, Mintu.
Great, thank you, Kate. And then Ben. And I will also close by saying we will send out, this was recorded, we'll send out the video, and then we'll also send out a note to see who wants to continue to be part of this conversation and how. I can't remember if we had a form that was already to send, but if someone on my team has that, go ahead and put it into the chat. Otherwise, we will send out an interest form so folks can indicate whether they want to continue to be part of this. Ben, final comments, thoughts, reflections.
Thank you so much, Mintu, to you for bringing us together and for this really rich discussion from people from across the world, from different sectors, different experiences, all contributing really, really thoughtfully, and to the panel as well. I mean, I leave this conversation quite upbeat, in the sense that this is a very painful and difficult time. I live in Thailand, and on the Thai-Burma border, hospitals just shut, and Burmese refugees have died as a result of those hospitals shutting. It's been absolutely not a moment of empowerment, excitement, or liberation for them. It's been a moment of death and destruction, and we have to avoid that type of precipitous collapse, and we have a moral responsibility to do so. And to the extent that narrative and communications helps prevent that type of precipitous collapse, we have a moral obligation to get that narrative and communications right. It literally is a matter of life and death. Now, why am I upbeat? Because people have brought such brilliant ideas, and because also I think that sometimes what can seem like a rivalrous conversation about what is smart and what is good, or what is moral and what is wise as being in contestation, that actually often we find that they're not. That often the ways in which societies develop moral principles was they're actually ways to abstract what people have learned from experience works. And then actually, when you say in Ubuntu, I am because you are, that's not just a moral or theological point. It's literally true. It's what public health confirms. I am healthy because my neighbor is healthy. And we also know from security, I am secure, I am at peace, I am at safe, because my neighbor is at peace, is secure, is safe. And we know from economics that I can thrive in secure prosperity because my neighbor thrives in secure prosperity. So actually, the mutual interest argument, which does talk to people about, yes, you do have a stake in this, you're not losing, is not an argument that actually takes us away from our values, but one that confirms it. I mean, here's a quote about mutual interest. There is an interrelated structure of reality. We are all tied in an inescapable network of mutuality. Whatever affects one directly affects all indirectly. I can never be what I ought to be until you are what you ought to be. And you can never be what you ought to be until I am what I ought to be. Now, that was Reverend Martin Luther King in a letter from Birmingham jail. And yet he was making an argument that you could say was the argument of mutual interest. So I think that if that can thrive as a narrative in the global north, doing better than the charity narrative, it's one that respects what governments and organizations in the global south have been calling for. It's more accurate, as Ida has pointed out, and Kate has pointed out, to the work that actually happens. And as other colleagues have talked about, in all of those reforms that we seek to get to improve international development, international cooperation, that narrative is facilitative of those. If you want to make the argument, for example, for global public investment, or you want to make the argument for increasing developing countries' share in institutions, that mutual, we all contribute, we all benefit narrative actually helps facilitate that. And we find often with policy actually that narrative comes first. The right do this very well. Once you create an anti-immigrant narrative, then you get a million different anti-immigrant policies. Policies don't start, the narrative that starts. But if we can shift the conversation to mutual interest, mutual benefit, we can prevent that precipitous collapse, and we can help engender and birth a better, fairer way of doing development assistance. So I'm really optimistic. I would say this is really, really hard work and really difficult. And so people won't get the wording and the precise communications right in one go. And that's exactly why we need this group. That's exactly why we need each other. We need to trade lessons, and we need to be able to share with each other. We tried this part worked, this part didn't. What do we do next? But I do feel together we can get through this. I'm so glad that we've had this conversation. We have been in a rut, in a tough place, but together we're gonna get out and end up somewhere better. Thank you, Mintu. Thank you all.
Thank you so much, everyone. Thank you. And this was such a thrill, such a great conversation. We will continue this. We'll be in touch with you over email, those of you who've registered, and reach out also, ps@projectstarling.org if you don't hear from us. All right. Thanks so much. Thanks to our wonderful speakers on this panel, and we will see you again soon.